It's the Redbird Reboot podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Arizona Cardinals fans, let me make sure I get our banner hidden there. Welcome into the Redbird Reboot podcast. We got our Cardinals roundtable all set to go. Got my co-host Marcos Labrada's down there. We also got a couple of guests today, at least here. We've got at Jocomo, the Cardinal Rule, aka Jocomo, and of course at WBJ Mitch, our own Walter Mitchell at RevengeOfTheBirds.com. And guys, it's been a while since we've had you on. How are each of you doing? Let's start with Walter, at least for the most part. Like, how are you, and how are you feeling as far as the vibes around this Arizona Cardinals team?
Oh, I'm great, Blake. Thanks for having me on. Great to be with all three of you, my favorite guys to be with, hang out, talk Cardinals. So I'd add Brett Coleman to that, who was on yesterday, and I can share a couple of tidbits. He had the best was he doesn't call Dortch the torch. He calls him the Dorcher chamber.
Nice.
So yeah, that was a fun gig with him, and he was very gracious to come on, and he had a lot of interesting points. But yeah, I'm feeling excited. I'm feeling uncertain about the defense in particular. The offense, I'm very excited about. I think we can do a lot with that. And I was posing the question about whether we ought to open things up a little more now that we have Marvin. And but we can talk about that. But yeah, great to be with you guys, and I'm really excited about having football this weekend against the Saints.
For sure. And then we got the professor himself as well. Joe, you got school. It's starting, which means football time. The real highlight of the fall is going to be starting up soon as well. How are you doing, sir?
I'm great. This is my favorite time of the year. You know, the semester starting up, there's a little bit of an energy from that. Football's around the corner. The weather's about to get nicer. So many things to be excited about. And the Cardinals are one of those things for me this year. I like Walter, I have some, question marks, but I'm viewing this as sort of a, part of a progression, and where they're at right now in terms of what they've done. I'm very happy with. They weren't going to be, a contender in year two, but in terms of some of the things they've done to both raise the floor and the ceiling on the talent, I'm really excited about. And obviously we'll get into a lot more of that.
Absolutely. So let's go and kick it off, at least for the most part, with we've talked a little bit about feeling some optimism for the Cardinals. A lot of that, I think, centers around Kyler Murray being healthy, a second year for a lot of what we have with Jonathan Gannon and company. One of the things that is interesting to be able to see as far as with this team is they've also shown quite a bit of, I would say, anticipation of some of these different, players going away. DJ Humphries is no longer with the team, gets released. They have a guy up there ready to go. We've seen how they cut DeAndre Hopkins. They were able to get a Marvin Harrison Jr. brought in. One of the things they've talked about has been being able to stay committed to someone like a Zaven Collins, who they feel like is a strong player, and they give him an extension. Of course, unfortunately, it falls on the heels, speaking of vibes, of a torn ACL for BJ Ojulari. So with how everything is stacked up for the most part with the Cardinals, we've got some questions, at least ultimately, about if they're addressing the pass rush enough. Some fans have wanted to make some trades for the most part. Marcos also has a really interesting idea that we wanted to discuss with you guys as we kind of kicked off our podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to get that video on. I found a clip of one video file that I want to obviously share with about Zaven Collins and whatnot. This is on a naked boot that he obviously is able to track down the quarterback. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because his speed is uncanny for his size. His size, I've said this from the very beginning, he is not supposed to move the way he moves, and he does so. And me and Walter have obviously shared our concern about like keeping him at the edge position, and we've talked about this. Like, remember me and you, Blake, we shared our thoughts about it, and we have seen some success from Zaven Collins when it comes to like the edge, being able to defend the run and having to hold his own against really good tackles and whatnot because of that size and whatnot. But the production when it comes to like getting sacks, which is what the big money pays for the edge position, is obviously that comes first for like a lot of teams. They're signing you long term because they want you to produce like, you know, sacks and money, the money, like, you know, stat basically. But being that he's able to be a good run defender is also a positive for our defense when it comes to running to that side of the field. So if you guys want to go ahead and share your thoughts, obviously you guys got control of the video if you guys want to go ahead and back and forth on this one. But this is just Zaven just getting that sack on the naked boot, just tracking the quarterback down. Quarterback doesn't expect him when he turns around. He sees a 265-pound behemoth coming at him with 4.6 speed.
Yeah, perfect technique, guys. Kept the outside shoulder, went outside in, wouldn't give up contain. We're gonna, if anything, he was gonna have to, the quarterback would have to tuck it in underneath where the help is, Geno Smith. So gotta love that. Zaven is one of our best athletes, and we can talk about edge or other positions, but on this play, fantastic.
He definitely gets him off guard because of that speed.
Yeah.
So what do you guys what do you think, Blake and Joseph? I know Blake, you are for him being on edge. Joe, I'm not sure what you would see him as or perform as or prefer him as. Do you want him at edge or at inside linebacker?
That's a great question. Let me start by saying I really like the extension. It's low risk. They're going to have the cap space. They're not it's not a huge contract. It's certainly not long term, just a couple of years. So it's not really going to be prohibitive. And he's a great athlete, so you're going to get production out of him. The question is where. I liked him as an inside linebacker, right? As a Mike Moore, but here's what I will say. I did just a little very simple number crunching before we went live. The way they use him as an edge isn't necessarily consistently this traditional pin your ears back, go after the quarterback kind of edge. I just did some quick math. Looking at on PFFs, they record their snaps as run defense snaps, pass rush snaps, or coverage snaps, right? And Zaven Collins, about 43% of his snaps were true pass rush snaps. Now let's compare that to a few other players. Now, Cameron Thomas, for example, was 56%. Dennis Gardeck, 48%. And a player from another team that we all know, Hassan Reddick, was 65% roughly, right? So compare those to Zaven, about 43%. They're moving him around and using him more as a run defending edge, sometimes in coverage. He's getting a fair number of pass rush snaps. It's certainly more than the other inside linebackers on the roster. But the way they use him in this defense is just a little bit more hybrid. And I think that role, you need to think of it in those terms, that they're not just telling him go after the quarterback. They're having him do other things about 10 to 15% more than the other edge rushers. So it's one of those things where, it's easy to sit back here on the outside and give my opinion, but there's just a certain part of me that trusts the coaching staff to know what their scheme is and have a reason for what they're doing with him. But however you add it up, I like having him on the roster for a couple more years. The physicality and the traits you're talking about are great. Whether they move him back to Mike or keep him at edge and use him in this sort of hybrid edge role, he's going to be a benefit, a positive part of this defense one way or the other. Would I prefer him at Mike? Sure. But I'm going to defer a bit to the coaches who know where he fits and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, Marcos, I think the biggest key for me was looking at when you're talking about finding success as a player, a lot of times that can be finding your niche. Like, You may not be that guy who's going to go out and get double-digit sacks every season, but if you're one of those guys that teams can't run at you for the most part, that's, I think, where you can make your bread and butter. I'm with Joe in that I think that I liked how Zaven fit a bit better back when it seemed like there was more of a defined role that they were going to have for an Isaiah Simmons, as I don't think that Simmons was that prototypical guy you could put on the inside. And what we've kind of seen with Isaiah, I think, ultimately, has been that this style of defense, trying to be able to find a fit for at the level, they've been able to at least find one for Zaven that's been there on the edge. And a lot of that has been, and not just a run defender, but you mentioned the size, you mentioned the athleticism. One of the areas that I likened him to with Hassan Reddick and why I wanted the Cardinals to kind of keep Hassan Reddick after the 2020 season was because we saw in that year with Jones when he moved out of that inside linebacker role and was the play at that Sam spot, he had the athleticism to keep up with tight ends in coverage. Cardinals, they were getting obliterated by tight ends if you're looking at how Vance Joseph's defense was back in 2019. Even going into 2020, we saw them shore some of that up with Jalen Thompson playing a bit more, with how Buda was able to go into coverage on the tight end. But with the smaller guy there, you can't just have a smaller safety be there consistently. Having someone who's got that size and the athleticism to drop back and not be a liability in coverage was something that we saw Reddick be able to do back in that 2020 season. He's gone on to be able to show up as more of that premier edge rusher. On the other side of that coin, if you want to look at last year as far as the total defensive PFF grades, the top overall defensive grade for Cardinals in 2023 was Zaven Collins, and a lot of that was because he was able to go out there and be solid and consistent against the run from the edge. They call it setting the edge against the run. And then on the coverage side of things, the Cardinals did not have like good coverage last year for the most part. Like part of the thing that they ran into was there were some guys who were just struggling overall in coverage. And I think a lot of that was because the team as a whole just was missing, guys up front to stop the run. They were missing their Mike linebacker and Kaiser White, who probably had to play Mike linebacker. And instead of putting Zaven at that spot, they said, you know what? He's a guy who can hold up and do well enough in coverage. He even got an interception week 1 last year, I believe, against Sam Howell. He had one he was able to take to, I think, the house for the most part, at least, against the Seahawks in 2022. We were able to kind of see that fit develop for him where I think you're saying, hey, you may never be that top tier pass rusher, but if you can have maybe 1 or 2 years where he can go out and get some sacks that fall his way and be able to be that guy who's consistent, then all you really need is to have a Batman, knowing that you've already got your Robin on the roster. I think it's a good move to be able to put him and take that run defense, something that I think we wanted to see that from the inside linebacker spot. What do they do instead? Cardinals go out, they bring in another guy in Mack Wilson who actually ranked higher in PFF and actually was more productive as a run defender, who I think is probably more of that prototypical Mike, who we've seen him be able to rush the passer at times too. I think putting together more of those areas and building a kind of identity of we want to be able to be firm against the run, not just with our big guys up front with defensive end and defensive line, but having guys and linebackers who are strong against the run and forcing teams to have to throw the ball on you. I think that is a identity for the Cardinals, and that's something that I think that Zaven does fit into that identity at edge. We'll see how that works long term because, like you said, you got guys on 1-year deals who are coming in now having to kind of be that main linebacker spot. You've got BJ Ojulari, who I think we were hoping could kind of be that Batman for the most part. Now it does feel like you're probably in a spot if you're the Arizona Cardinals where you're going to have to address that pass rush, knowing that Zaven, he's probably not going to be that number 1 guy. And I don't think we should expect him to be. And certainly he's not being paid like he is going to be that player. I do think that he's being paid like what I wish they would have done with Hassan Reddick back in 2021, extending him on a cheap deal for the next couple of years and hoping that you're able to hit it big with him and that those sacks come his way.
Yeah, well.
Oh, go ahead.
First of all, I'm just so opposed to him playing edge versus Mike for a number of reasons. It said so from the very beginning when they moved him. I'm even more adamant now because, first of all, Zaven Collins is a player, is the kind of athlete you never take off the field. And last year, all he had was 500 snaps, and he was healthy the whole year. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry. That is just plain ridiculous to have him on the bench half the snaps, half the defensive snaps. Second, and so I sort of put an asterisk, Blake, on that PFF grade because really on a half season. And it's picking his spots. Pissed me off too that last year, every time Gardeck made a good play, they take him out of the game. Talked with Brett Coleman about that yesterday. I don't get that kind of coaching. But here's the thing. Yesterday, Brett Coleman made a tremendous point. He said, against the Rams, you guys have no shot. None. Now, if they got those two guards in free agency and Avila is emerging as a center, there's no way you're going to defend the Rams with Kaiser White and Mac Wilson as inside linebackers.
Mhm.
There is no way. So, but he said he likes, I think basically Wilson and Kaiser are both kind of like better weak side inside linebackers.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what would be fascinating to me is Mac Wilson played really well when he played on the edge last year,
Right.
in New England. If they could do a flip-flop, put Mac Wilson with his speed and aggressiveness, and he had a bunch of sacks on the edge and kick Xavier inside. Now you got a guy who can take on those Rams interior with, they got Jonah Jackson and they got Dotson. Dotson was a prize guard free agent last year. I mean, they're loaded up front, and we gotta somehow get into the Rams' heads. And now that Aaron Donald's gone and everything, but I don't want to concede that. I don't want to say you have no chance against the Rams, but I get what Brett is saying. If we're not, it's one thing to be stout on the edge, but if you're not physical in the middle with all of your players, fortunately we got Bilal Nichols, we got Justin Jones, we got Darius Robinson now, Roy Lopez. So we got some guys up front who can slow things down. We got to have thumpers. We play in a division that's run heavy. So, Marcos, piggyback on that. What's your reaction to that?
I got a couple of comparisons to bring up about Mike. I was gonna say Mike as a linebacker, and I was gonna say Collins as a it was gonna be all coming out backwards. It's because I'm looking up the details about Mac Wilson because it is interesting. I did see, obviously, Zayvon Collins had 4 sacks last season. I believe. Did he have 4 sacks? I'm not 100% sure, but I did see what Mac Wilson had, and he did have himself 4 sacks. He's 6'1", 246, so he's more of like a stumpy type of linebacker, which you do need those kind of linebackers to be able to take on the new age run. And we talked to EJ Snyder about this, that like a lot of teams that are doing reverting back to like a run heavy defense, they're starting to get their guard and their center play together. They're starting to like address those positions because of the fact that those are what controls like the line of scrimmage when it comes to like the type of runs we're facing. And now all that conversion from the 6'1", 6-foot linebackers that we were getting away with, the speedsters, are now starting to get trampled and they're starting to get run over because these guards are starting to get, they're starting to get faster. They're starting to get more athletic. They're using a fullback again. So obviously a fullback is just a linebacker on the field that's taking on another linebacker. So they're putting their size up in the middle. And of course we have the prototypical linebacker on our team that I don't know how you guys felt about him being a linebacker, but I thought he played like he was playing in an ascending role where he was getting better and better every single year. And even in his second year, he went over 100 tackles and he handled that position well. And he even had a pick 6 against the Seattle Seahawks. He has really good games against the Seahawks. Now that I think about it, there's 2 positives to him on both sides of the ball. On him and as an inside linebacker, he's a good spot dropping zone defender, And as an edge defender, he's a good flat defender because they have him do that a lot. Whenever they're trying to bring an exotic defense, or whenever they have a situation where they need him to drop into that flat zone, he can hold his own against like wide receivers on that side of the field. But once again, that's only him being effective on one side of the field. And we're gonna learn real quick whether this way that we're going with our linebackers, exactly what you mentioned, with not only with the Los Angeles Rams, but with the 49ers being our division, and possibly even like the Seahawks going into that mode as well. We're gonna learn real quick how effective they're gonna be against those against that guard play, because if it comes down to the point like it has been where we still can't defend the run, on the second level at least, then hopefully the guys up front can pick up the slack for the guys behind them, because it's gonna get ugly if we don't fix that part. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Yep.
one of the things that's interesting also, you brought this up, Walter, is people are talking about the pass rushing snaps, at least for Mac Wilson. He's gotten a healthy number of reps, because I was there on, I think it was the red-white practice. He also said back on August 18th, there was I believe it was a interview that he had as far as with just, post-practice. He said, hey, I'll be ready to go at low LB if you're called on. I've got ability as an edge rusher. I've got ability as one of those guys. It reminds me of how Dennis Gardeck's original role was on special teams and an inside linebacker, and then the team moved him to outside linebacker and edge, and all of a sudden you're just like, he's got one of the most efficient pass rushing, not just like grades, but like had to essentially double-digit sack season on a small number of snaps. And I think at least seeing some of that adjustment from the Cardinals staff of being able to use positional flexibility, I think it's the idea of, when we talk about positional flexibility, there are advantages and disadvantages. We've seen that, I think, on both sides, where on one hand you can say, hey, look, like Zaven was able to get over 100 tackles at an inside linebacker and then move to the edge and is able to have essentially the highest defensive grade on the team, because the Cardinals last year, their defense was essentially like a what's it called? Like with not a luchador, but like a matador with like the little red cape, just letting whatever goes run by you, because they just did not have any sort of depth. They're starting rookies last year. As far as number of snaps, it's kind of ridiculous, where you can say that the Cardinals may have had an identity if we want to put rotating guys onto the line, but only one player actually played more than essentially, I think it was the like 500 to maybe 700 snaps or so, and that would be Jalen Thompson. Was like the only guy who played pretty much every single snap last year on defense, because Budda Baker had missed a few games because he was hurt. Kaiser White got hurt and left with the season. The rest of the guys were all rotating through, and guys like Sean Murphy-Bunting and Justin Jones are not Arizona Cardinals last year. I think that maybe you can say that the argument of rotating guys on the defensive line, I think it's the Philly idea, where Philly would draft a ton of defensive linemen and rotate those guys through. Part of that is you have to draft some of those players high. Cardinals have only drafted one guy that high so far, and it's Darius Robinson, their second first-round pick, who has looked good in terms of pass rushing from the interior. I think of the 2022 Cardinals, who it was basically J.J. Watt was in the middle of the field, and then you also had their one guy out of Boston College in Zach, who was able to kind of be that other Zach Allen. And they were able to get a pass rush, but ultimately at the end of the day, that team was not able to stand up that well against the pass or the run, because in the NFL, your best bet to get to the quarterback is quickest lane possible, and the quarterback having to drop back the most amount of yardage. So essentially you need to have it be solid up against the run, which the Cardinals were not last year, and having good edge rushers that when teams are having to go back into those third and long situations, you're able to get at them from the outside on a straight line. I agree with you guys that it's going to be really interesting to see how the team adjusts this year with their defense, because I think unlike last year, they do have bodies. They've got a Justin Jones. They've got a Bilal Nichols. How does it look when they have an area as a weakness? Do we see potentially Kaiser take on the Mike role, and we see Mac Wilson drop into the edge on the other side? And then you've got a guy like a Zaven Collins can drop back into coverage with a Dennis Gardeck on the other side. That's one of the areas that I think seeing that creativity, it's going to tell us quite a bit about the coaching staff, but also I think it'll tell us about what the Cardinals' needs may still be. Also, I'm curious if you have any thoughts, at least on looking at this talent pool in general, Joe, because I think a lot of Cardinals fans can look at this last year and can say, gosh, the defense was abysmal last year. Cardinals drafted a lot of offensive guys this year. Do you think that was out of the basically drafting to how this draft was stacked and kind of adding talent where the talent was? Or do you think that Arizona is putting together more of an offensive identity for this year and the defense is going to have to follow and take some time?
That's a great question. I think in general, Jonathan Gannon is taking the approach of giving his offensive coaching staff all the tools he can give them, and then raising the floor on the defense and trusting between he and his defensive coordinator that they have the acumen to make that work. And, I think, you and I talked about this a little bit before. I think they raised the ceiling on the offense more than they did on the defense, right? In terms of the high end talent, but they raised the floor on both. And, I look at things again from a roster building process. I look from a long term, and I understand the concerns about middle linebacker, and those are valid. But I still like the moves they're making from a process standpoint. Yes, they're not ready to contend at the highest level this year. They might surprise people and make the playoffs. I think that's a possibility. The defense, I think, will be better than last year, but it's not going to be a top defense. But they've done a good job of addressing that defensive line, right? We've talked about it quite a bit this offseason, brought in all those guys that Walter mentioned and a few more, right? Darius Robinson as well. And that defensive front may not have star power, but it is stout with legitimate NFL players. And I think they're going to probably lean on that more, the defensive front, like the line more for the run stopping than they are the linebackers. And I think, the edge rusher we will talk about is still a concern, but the coverage I think is going to be better too, right? Murphy Bunting is a solid player. They brought in some second and third round cornerbacks. They have young players that need to develop and show that they can be that, but it's a lot better than all the undrafted free agents plus Marco Wilson we were dealing with a couple of years ago. I have a lot more faith in a cornerback room with Murphy Bunting, Garrett Williams, and whoever survives to get the starting role out of some of the other young players. So I think the defense, it's going to be a work in progress. And the defensive coaching staff did the best they could last year without the guys, right? And I know Brett Coleman and EJ Snyder in their kind of assessment of the Cardinals said something very similar to this. They just didn't have the personnel to make it work. They have better personnel this year. It's not elite personnel, but it's NFL caliber personnel. And I think, if the offense can, meet its potential, I think it can be a top 10 offense. The players that are maybe even better than that, top 5 is kind of the ceiling, but I think the players are there to be that if they, if everything comes together. The defense, it's probably going to be bottom third, but if it can be near the top of that bottom third, right? If it can be ranked 27th, more like 25th or 23rd, right? If you can get defense in that low 20s, right? And a good offense, that's a really good second year, I think, in terms of roster building and coaching staff, considering how anemic this defense was last year and how uneven the offense was, though efficient in some areas.
Yeah, definitely. I think if we shift into talking about training camp, we do want to make sure that we're looking at the positives. One of the biggest things, I think, as far as a positive, we have to start with talking about Marvin Harrison Jr., who has looked great so far in training camp. One of the plays that I got to see, at least as far as with the drills and in the practice, is there was a kind of end zone out route where essentially the goal of the drill is you run forward. You basically then have to at least make an option where you get to pick, do you break inside, break outside, to kind of have to put the DB essentially into conflict. And he did such a quick job of with this stutter step and then turning that he would be able to have gotten separation to the point where I was like, all right, this is very, very smooth. And then he essentially glided to the back of the end zone and did one of those, they call it the toe drag swag, where he's able to kind of catch the ball. And his spatial awareness was what stood out to me, because there were some players who were a little bit closer inbounds and some who were actually like maybe would have gotten just out of bounds at the end of the line. And he like knew exactly where he was in space, was able to make the catch essentially with like the two hands, being able to secure the ball. And the way I looked at it was very interesting, because it was the first time in a while I had seen a rookie come in with that level of fluidity and athleticism since John Brown. Now, what's funny is that John Brown is the guy who's like about 5'10" and maybe like 175, 185 pounds, maybe soaking wet. Marvin at 6'4", 210 pounds. The fact that he looked like a smaller John Brown, that was, I know, one of his pre-draft things. And it was getting to see some of that live. It was going, oh, this is going to be a really, really fun rookie year for him. What really surprised me wasn't that Marvin stole the show. It was that Trey McBride caught literally everything that went his way. He had the highest amount of, as far as when you're talking about like forms of leadership, of being able to cheer on and praising guys on the sideline, being that hype man, as it were. Looking over in the guy who's struggling at least to probably make the roster this year in Travis Volokek, makes a great one-handed catch on the back with I think it was Daydre and Taylor Demison draped all over him. And who's the first guy runs out there hyping him up for that catch is Trey McBride. And I'm like, okay, this is one of those areas when you're talking about Kyler Murray coming back, you're talking about adding Marvin Harrison Jr. We can't forget at least that Trey McBride last year did go and become a star, and he's looked like a superstar so far in training camp. I think that adding that into the James Conner and the strong run game that we had, there's some optimism I think that you can have, like you said, for the Cardinals offense this year. Joe, what are some of the thoughts you have so far on looking at the offense and where it's at heading into training camp thus far?
Yeah, I love where it's at. I think there's a little bit of when you look back to Cliff, we're so used to having, 4 wide receiver sets, and some people maybe feel like, well, who's the third or fourth, whatever option. But this offense is going to be more of a run-heavy offense, right? Like we saw in Cleveland. And I think more in terms of teams like Cleveland and Baltimore, if you've got 2 really good pass catchers and a good running game, you're set, right? Like Marvin Harrison and Trey McBride are that. And then you add, Michael Wilson will be a nice, savvy kind of move the sticks possession receiver, with a few other things he brings. And we all know, what Greg Dortch, the Dorcher Chamber, what he brings, right? So, and then you've got a couple, you've got some guys they drafted that, got that Wilson, I think it was the guy from UAB, I think, who's got Palmer. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. From UAB, who's got some speed, and like to just even if all he does is go out there and run some go routes to take the top off the defense sometime, that's a great use of the 6th-round pick. So like they've got, I think, all the pieces you need to have a really effective offense as long as Kyler's healthy. It seems like he's taken to the offense from what we saw last couple games of last year, and the offensive line kind of holds it together. But in terms of, do we have what we need in terms of the pass catchers? Absolutely. You can have a top 10 offense with McBride, Marvin Harrison Jr., and a collection of other guys playing their roles.
That's good. Now, I do want to at least check in, at least now, with Walter. The offense is in a unique spot, I think, because there's not really any excuses anymore for the offense, like even in they're coming into this year healthy for the most part. I'm curious, how do you see as far as with how this Cardinals offense is put together? Is this one of those areas where I know that as far as been talking about team building, that you were one of those people who looked at Rome Odunze in the offseason, at least with, but you've also been a huge, huge fan, at least of what McBride's been able to do as far as not just the receiving game of just being a incredibly dependent option, but improving his blocking to the point of being able to be that two-way player. What are some of your thoughts on what we're seeing from the offense as we kind of enter in with the expectations for the passing game for maybe the first time since we were expecting Hopkins and Hollywood Brown, and then our expectations just went after we saw that neither of those guys were going to really play together with Kyler more than one game?
I think we're going to see a lot of, Joe was alluding to this, I think we're going to see a lot of 12 and 13 personnel. I think they love the trio of Trey McBride, Higgy Bear, and Tip Ryman. I think you're going to see those guys in a 13 package with Marvin Harrison Jr. Now you have 4 tall, gifted receivers. Ryman's a better receiver than people realize. They didn't throw to him much at Illinois. And we won't throw to him that much either. And by the way, this kid Vokalek, I think, is a keeper. I think he'll make the roster. I think they'll keep 4, and he'll be the 4th. So, and he fits the bill, and he's a tremendous blocker, and at his size. So, and he's a big kid too. So, yeah. I think you're going to see a lot of that. You're going to see the power running game, the wide zones with Connor, and I said this before the season started when people were cutting Imari DiMaccardo. I just couldn't fathom that. I think he's got a good chance to be RB2, just because of he brings so much to the table. There's something special about that kid. And Trey Benson, I think the three of them are going to mix in there and carry this thing from a running back standpoint. So we have depth there, and I think that, and it's impressive. And DeMercado on passing situations is our best. He came in being a pro at pass pro, which rookies never are. So love the depth there. And like you've been saying, it was kind of mystifying to me why the Cardinals waited until middle of day 3 to take an edge rusher. I don't get that at all. Given that we didn't have a sack for the last one sack in the last 6 weeks of a season. But back to the offense. I think at times though they'll open it up a little bit and run some trips to one side. You'll get 4 receivers out there with 3 wide receivers with 1 tight end. And I think they might employ a little bit of motion this year, which they didn't do with Kyler. They've been doing it in camp. They've been doing short motions with Dortch, which I think is a great idea. Motion him into a stack or into a bunch. So I think you're going to see some diversity there. The thing that concerns me about Marvin, since we were talking about Marvin, is I wish they get up and play in his face and bump and run him every time he's on the line. That's what the other teams are going to do. And it just mystifies me that they have, every play I watch for Marvin is they're up in a press look, but they don't touch him. And so I'm hoping
college football, man. It's so weird.
Play him in preseason where he's going to have to get off the bump, and Kyler's going to have to adjust to that. Because right now it's just easy peasy for him. If you don't, like you were saying, stutter step and then take the in cut against good teams, they're not going to get that easy, because they're going to get into his chest and they're going to leverage him, and in some cases they're going to keep a spy to double on him. So I'm hoping that they will do something in camp to accelerate his progress there. I don't think it's a given he's going to be able to get off a press as like a pro yet. I mean, I wouldn't expect that from any rookie, especially from some of the really good ones. So.
Yeah. And I think what we saw in camp too is, like, I kind of agree that if you put him against like a Sauce Gardner, Cardinals are playing the Jets this year. Sauce has been one of those guys who, like you said, he just tries to be an eraser by jamming you, getting you at the line. Right. We'll need to see some of that from Marvin. That's one of the downsides of training camp, is you're able to see guys who are like super athletic show off the athleticism. But when you put on the pads, you see a little bit more. But really, it comes down to a lot of the preseason games. What I think is interesting is we've seen this Cardinals team with their offensive coordinator do a bit more adjusting than we saw in the past with some places. We've seen Marvin already operate out of the slot. And what that did was it put Greg Dortch outside. And you're like, okay, well, in this scenario, if you've got a taller cornerback for the most part, you see them line up and man across the board, you kind of do a shift motion for the most part. If Kyler sees that he follows Marvin as a man, he knows I got man coverage for the most part. That means I can read my defenders, knowing that Greg Dortch is going to be able to kind of open up for the most part underneath and get some of those yards after catch. If they don't shift, all of a sudden you're talking about zone coverage. And you're like, wow, okay, so Marvin's now probably going to either be drawing double coverage, because you want to probably have a linebacker and safety combo, if not like your nickel corner on that. You've got a size advantage. On the outside, meanwhile, if you're putting your largest corner on the outside, because you know what, Marvin can reach up with that 6'3" height to be able to get over guys. And we've seen his hops. Like, there's a huge hop that he has over 2 players for a touchdown, I think, in a photo that's pinned to my timeline. Now you're like, I got a larger guy and Greg Dortch is on there for the most part. If I can be able to design a spot where Dortch is able just to outrun the guy and be able to use that change of direction, change of ability, you can find mismatches across the board. I do love you bringing up Tip Ryman as well. Marcos, the Cardinals have run more 13 personnel, it feels like, than anyone last year, and they're probably going to do more of it this year. What is some of the stuff you've seen from tight ends for the Arizona Cardinals that really it feels like they're embracing this type of run-heavy identity and then opening up a lot of play action to some of those tight ends.
Well, they're trying to commit more towards having a I formation or single back formation from under center. So that's obviously good news because seeing something like that is where the NFL is trending back towards and whatnot. And it helps with like angles when it comes to like running backs and being able to like read like whatever gap they're supposed to be attacking and whatnot. Obviously, you read from outside in when it comes to outside zone runs. And with tight ends being as mobile as they are and as good as they are, becoming blocking tight ends, they have to be proficient in being like not only at the line of scrimmage type of blocking tight end, but also open field blocking. I think Brett Coleman mentioned something along those lines on your podcast yesterday, Walter Mitchell, that there's two different types of styles, and Trey McBride actually is proficient in like both type of blocks and whatnot because he likes to get at it. He's not the best, but he likes to get at it, and he shows a lot of effort. So that's great on him. Tip Bryman was taken for a reason. He was taken because he was a athletic freak at his size. He's going to be one of those type of tight ends that's just going to look for work. Like whenever there's a run to the inside or outside and there's the open field, he's going to look towards like trying to smash a safety. I'm sorry, my cat keeps distracting me here, trying to get a part of the podcast. Higgins, I loved Higgins as a receiving tight end. So when you have these type of players that are not slouches on any position, and you can like throw them out there on a certain formation, maybe 22 or maybe 13 personnel, it disguises to the defense what you're doing on offense, and you want that, especially if you're gonna plan on going static this year, because we've already spoken about that. We've spoken about static versus motion. When you have motion, you see a lot of rotations in the second level. And when you have static, you want to disguise as much as you want because you don't want to tip your hat to the defense. So how do you do that? You do that with personnel. You do that 100% with personnel. And tight ends are very important to that because you can run out of a tight end, like a heavy tight end set, and you can also throw a pass on a heavy tight end set if you have someone like Trey McBride, because you know that he can come down with the ball. So from what I've seen at like last year, especially with these snaps, my favorite type of throws to Trey McBride that he's really well in being able to throw to do is he runs the corner route from a attached tight end position. And when he gets that leverage, and he's reading obviously the leverage of the safety, when he gets that leverage and he wins that leverage battle, Kyler Murray can just throw it over the top and drop it in the basket, and he can make that pass. So only certain tight ends can be able to be that good catching the ball and running that type of route. And with that route itself, to me, that's a lot of damage because you have two-way goes from that position. So I love what they're doing with the tight ends, and I think it's going to come to the benefit if they are, once again, remaining in static formations.
Yeah, last year we were able to see Trey McBride line up at one point in the backfield where you're like, okay, there's the tight end lining up, and it's not in the obvious halfback role, but in more of like that fullback blocking role. And then what ended up happening was that we had one play where he essentially crossed the face of Kyler Murray to be able to block a guy coming off of the edge, but he also moved from one side of him to like the other, and then when you cross their face, so essentially you're like, Cardinals are looking at a pass rush. It looks like the defense shifted because you saw McBride went there. He shifted to the other side. They're like, I got a free rush. He instead crosses the face, and now all of a sudden you've not just got Kyler protected, like you said. You got a guy who's more than able to take on an edge rusher because that's in one of those areas where Trey McBride as a blocker is able to do that. And you also, by moving that pre-snap motion, were able to identify, was the defense going to shift? Were they going to try to end up having a stunt where someone was going to try to move around at least on some of the line? Were you going to have it look like where the defensive backfield was going to shift? We were able to at least see, like Marco said, that the Cardinals may not be doing the same thing of like adopting the Dolphins where you've got Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle just running around everywhere left and right, but you're able to use those formations to be able to put your quarterback in a spot where he's able to succeed. And I think that, like you said, Walter, Tip Ryman, he's already been getting first team reps with the Arizona Cardinals. There was a great catch that he made. He doesn't have that same, I guess you can say, fluidity of McBride, but he does have that size and catchability where you can at least see the athleticism. And again, like, he wasn't necessarily like one of those Kyle Pitts type of athletes where you're like, he's a receiver with tight end size. He's one of those guys who, like, for his size and speed ability, and you're watching on tape, he's just bulldozing guys when they're throwing it to him and these short passes underneath. I think that he'll be one of those players where you may be able to cover everything perfectly in the red zone for Arizona. You've got everything buttoned up to a T, but Tip Ryman may be able to sneak out, and he's got that big body that he'll just be able to push people back across and get across the end zone line. We've talked about some of the receiving weapons. I want to talk a little bit now with the defensive backs, because last year we had one Pro Bowler on the team. It was Budda Baker. I think that his role, for the most part, between him and Jalen Thompson, was probably not the traditional role we've seen for Budda Baker. We did probably see a bit more of what it could be when Garrett Williams was able to come in and play more of that nickel role. He actually kind of took on some of that playmaking role, and it seems like he's probably the starter opposite of Sean Murphy-Bunting, is what it seems like coming out of training camp. That's one of the areas that it'll be interesting to see if that slot formation puts Budda in a more of a playmaking role. Do we see kind of Jalen Thompson be able to move back for how they're doing their safeties? Walter, what are some of the thoughts that you have? And then we'll check in with Joe on what we could see from the Cardinals in coverage this year, because last year they were at times abysmal in coverage, and the only reason they weren't exposed more in coverage was because the Rams were just running the ball with Kyron Williams for like 10 yards a pop nearly every time in the 2 times that they played, because there ain't no defensive tackles there.
Yeah. First time ever we have like 4 or 5 kids who can play the slot. When we had none a couple of years ago. And for some reason, Steve Keim ignored it every draft. I was begging all the way back to, Trevor Mooring, to, Trent McDuffie was my favorite. Then it was Brian Branch last year. Well, we got the Rabbit now. And Brett Coleman loves this kid. And I fell in love with him pre-draft too. And I was mocking him in the 3rd. I didn't think he'd make it to the 4th, and neither did Brett. And so what a gift to have him. You're going to see a lot of three safety, scenarios with the Cardinals, probably 60-some% of the time with this kid, how versatile he is. He can play the slot really well. But you also have Garrett Williams, who can do that. You also have Katro Clark, who can play the slot. So there's versatility there. I don't understand Starling Thomas as a starter, which the new depth chart has. And people are saying he's had a great camp. Every time I look up, a highlight is someone scoring a TD on him. I didn't think he played that well last year. I don't get the hype on that kid. I mean, he looks like a good young player, but I don't think he's a NFL starting corner at this point in his career. Whereas I think Max Melton has a way higher ceiling. Max Melton can play the slot. I mean, he's any guy who was holding his own against Marvin Harrison Jr. in college ought to catch your attention. So having that flexibility is going to be huge. And, Sean Murphy-Bunting's looked really good. He's makes the Murphy name really proud.
Had some good pass breakups at the red-white practice. I was like, there you go. Do me proud.
He was, shouting out to you. So that's really real plus to have a CB1. And he's, he's long. He's got the length. He can cover just about everyone. He too can cover the slot. In fact, he covered the slot in the Super Bowl effectively. So that's really exciting. But I'd love to see our D-backs get more aggressive. I want to see more man-to-man, way more than what we saw last year. I want to see someone finally cover Tyler Lockett and Cooper Kupp. And Debo, we've gotten to because of Budda. Budda sits in the alley and freaks him out. But, but Ayuk we've been having trouble with. I hope they trade him and get him out of there. But now this kid Pearsall is going to be a factor. So, I like the way they're training. We're going to be young. I hope they keep all the top guys. I hope they don't cut K-Trell. I love that kid.
Mm.
And so does Brett. But Dadrion Taylor Demerson, the Rabbit, he's the prize pick in there that I think is going to be the versatile piece we've been missing, because he can play the back end where we got nailed so many times last year. And Buddha and Jalen are great underneath. They're not great in the back end. This kid he's versatile enough to be really good back there too. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, Marcus, we've talked about with where the defensive backs have been. I kind of agree that Starling Thomas, it seems like he's one of those guys who, with work ethic, gets the defense. I think that he's one of those higher floor, lower ceiling type of players where what I'm watching is like he's not blowing a coverage, but guys are also getting open and getting separation, getting catches on him. And that's one of the cases ultimately with cornerback it is one of those positions, unfortunately, that you're kind of as strong as your weakest one. And I'm curious, Marcos, how you feel for the most part about the defensive backs, because when talking about team building, Cardinals have just basically reset their entire cornerback room. There wasn't anyone to hang on to for the most part from the old regime. You really had Jalen Thompson and Budda Baker have been the two guys, and Budda's deal is up at the end of this season. He is going to be, I believe, entering age 30 going into next year's offseason. There hasn't been I think it's actually 29, I believe, is where it's because he's born in 96. So, yeah, he'll be heading into age 29 season. He's going to be looking to get paid again, at least at the top. He is still one of, I think, the top quality safeties in the NFL. And I think last year his role had to kind of be, we're not going to get beaten over the top for the most part as much as we can. And he had to kind of play a little bit out of his box role where he can be such a huge closer. What do you think as far as with the defensive backs when it comes to how the Cardinals may stack and where these rookies like Elijah Jones and Max Melton fit into the equation? Because that's one of the things I'm very curious to see is when you draft, I think 3 cornerbacks in a draft, you're going to have a lot of focus on those guys, especially with how corner was such a need for the Cardinals last year. We thought there was a chance that if one of those guys fell to the late first, they could take a corner.
Well, that's the thing about what Monty Ossenfort is doing approach-wise. Unfortunately, we're not going super high on these corners, but he's trying to do the shotgun approach. So he's trying to he's going younger at the position. We all know that. He wants obviously one leader of the team, which is SMB, Sean Murphy Bunting, as that, that veteran type of person. He's fits the athletic role. He fits the mold of, knowing what he's doing as far as like, being a good defender and whatnot. So the one thing that I will say about like what they're doing as far as like filling up the cornerback room with as many bodies as they possibly can is all they're trying to do is they're trying to see what skill sets each individual has, what they can do best, and what's their niche. So a lot of these corners have different niches. You have your athletic up on the line of scrimmage type of players like Max Melton, and then you have your smart like zone type of, always has his eyes on the quarterback type of player in Elijah Jones. And Elijah Jones is also no slouch when it comes to like being up on the line of scrimmage.
Right.
So that's what I love about Elijah Jones. And I was really high on that pick. I really like that as the Cardinals picked him up and stuff. And so one way or another, from this year's draft to last year's draft where they got Keitrell Clark, which I was a really big fan of, and I really love that pick. And the guy should have been manning the slot. And then you had, of course, another pick in I keep forgetting what his name is. What was the guy we got? Garrett Williams. There you go. Yeah. Garrett Williams, who came in as an injury, but he has been manning the slot a lot for the Cardinals. And that's actually been pretty interesting because I would have thought they would have played him more towards the outside.
Agreed.
So I don't understand why they changed it around, because it kind of reminds me of the last organization where it's like, this guy specializes in this role and he's telling you that that's where he specializes at. But instead you're playing him on the other side of the ball. You're playing him on the outside when his skill set showed that he can man the slot, where a lot of, new age, like NFL defensive, like gurus will tell you that the slot is a harder position to defend in today's NFL than it is towards the outside, mostly because of the fact that you have outside as the defense. Like you have the sideline as an extra defender, Whereas when you are on the inside, you have two-way goals to have to defend. You have to be part of the run scheme. You have to be good at being at least a decent tackler when it comes to being able to defend from from the slot and whatnot. You can't be a slouch on the outside. They make jokes about like how corners are horrible at being able to make tackles. So that's the reason why they're trying to push the runs to the outside, because they're trying to get the running back one-on-one on that cornerback where he can dominate. So I as far as this approach is, I honestly, I don't know how you guys feel, but I'm just hoping that one of those guys ascends to that level. I hope one of those guys becomes at least not only a starter, but can we at least get somewhat of a Pro Bowler on our team on cornerback? Can we get somebody that ascends up there? We have 4 shots at it. We have 4 young cornerbacks that we have on our roster, and one of those guys has to at least be able to pop. At least one of those guys should be able to be in that position where now he's our unquestioned starter for the next 5 or 6 years. He's going to get a second contract. And I'm kind of tired of these washouts that we keep drafting at cornerback, because we don't really pay attention too much to that position, even during the Steve Keim era. And so going with Monty Ossenfort, that is a position that we will have to acknowledge and address going forth and whatnot. So let's hope that the shotgun approach helps out. And I like to apologize to all you guys. I have a little bit of emergency to attend to, so it's going to be my last question, my last segment. And so I hope that we can run this podcast again. I love this. I call it the quadcast, or the because we have 4 of the brightest minds here, and just different perspectives, which is what I love. The fact that we all have different perspectives, different answers and whatnot. And so hopefully we can run this again. Maybe a few months from now, we'll talk about it, obviously within ourselves. But you guys have a wonderful day, and thank you guys for coming. And I hope you guys have a great, wonderful day to you guys and to everybody who's watching.
Hope everything's okay, pal.
Yeah, take care, Marcos. Good luck.
See you,
Take care, buddy. You're awesome.
Thank you. See you guys.
See you.
All right. Well, I think we can probably wrap up. We got 2 main topics left for training camp. The first one, of course, is you got to talk about stopping the run and running the ball. And that's something with the Arizona Cardinals. We've seen a lot of NFL teams for a while. Analytics people were making fun of it. Throwing the ball is way more explosive, uses up less time. What we've kind of seen has been NFL teams have looked at Patrick Mahomes. They've looked at Josh Allen. They've looked at a lot of those spread offenses. And they've gone, great, we've got lighter-sized defensive backs, more safeties are popping on the field. Cardinals, at least for a while, had one of those 3 safety systems that they ran. And what we've seen is that running the ball has come back into fashion. It's kind of like those ebbs and flows. And I think a lot of people are realizing now that it really does start with being able to have a strong run game, because you can maybe not win every single game with a strong run game, but you're going to be competitive and you're going to finish those games. We were able to see last year with the Cardinals, they were able to run the ball all over on that Eagles team. And we've been able to see that the Cardinals were run all over last year. I believe that they were 32nd in giving up rushing yards. And that's a tremendous, unfortunate thing to have attached to your team as a reputation, because I do think that a lot of that was less scheme focused and more just they didn't have the horses to be able to do it. When Kaiser White went out, we're talking about Dante Stills as a 7th round rookie, was their best starter. They're taking guys off of the street because of injury issues. The Denver Broncos had 70 points scored up on them, and they still finished higher than the Cardinals against the run. Arizona responded. They brought in 2 big proven defensive tackles. They brought in another Mike linebacker. And on the offensive side, we've been able to see that they at least have been kind of relying on some of these draft picks and bringing in a couple of veteran free agents, Jonah Williams being the main one, to kind of go out and bring this rushing offense to fruition. And then what they do, they added the best blocking tight end of the draft, and the guy who I had as my top running back in Trey Benson. You can tell the Cardinals went out and realized we were a good running offense last year. We want to be the best running offense in the NFL, I think is what they're setting out to do. And they want to be upgraded at running the ball on defense. Joe, what is some of your thoughts on with the Cardinals going toward this run heavy approach, at least? Because from everything we've seen so far, I feel like the Cardinals are more likely to keep 4 to 5 running backs than they are to keep maybe 6 wide receivers, which is a different approach than what we saw with Cliff Kingsbury and that air raid type of scheme.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's reminds me of what Baltimore typically does, right? You know, they run heavy. They've got a quarterback who is really good at running the ball, but they typically have a solid running game, and they really pass to their tight end, right? Which we're going to do that, but we also have Marvin Harrison Jr. And yeah, obviously, then you also look at obviously Cleveland, which is where Petzing came from. They had the two-headed, kind of monster running back attack a couple years ago. And I think that's absolutely what they're going to do. They're going to try to really wear teams down with the running game. But unlike some of those teams that are so run heavy, they have the potential to have a truly elite receiver, number one wide receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr., if he becomes what everyone hopes he will be, which is a whole other dimension of that. So that could be a really scary offense. And, a couple times you both have mentioned Tip Ryman, who I love. I did a video on him when they drafted him. And I just think he's one of those guys who's going to have, like, the stat sheet might not show it, but as this cog that makes everything else move, kind of like what Juszczyk does in San Francisco, but a little bit different. I think he's going to be such a key, especially once he kind of gets through that being a rookie and kind of really finds his role and hits his stride, what he's going to do as a blocker, right? Has the tools to be a top 2 or 3 blocking tight end in the league if he hits that development. But also the strength, right? He was stronger than a lot of offensive linemen in terms of his bench press reps and his movement, right? But as Walter mentioned, they didn't throw a lot to him, and he doesn't need to be an elite receiver, but all he needs to do is they're going to maybe, hit him in the flat once in a while when all the attention's everyone else. And with his speed and his power, he's going to take that for 20, 30 yards sometimes, right? But what he's going to do in all those pieces, right? He's going to help make that run blocking even better. He's going to be someone who can, kind of surprise you in the passing game. But just having a guy who potentially could be a true alpha as a run blocker, and they're going to build this offensive line to block the run as well. And then you've got the power running backs that they've got. I mean, it's going to be scary. And then you got to watch out for Marvin Harrison. So in terms of the offensive side, I love what they're doing. And I love the way they're building that. Yes, it's a pass happy league. But as y'all talked about before, a lot of teams have built their defenses for the passing defense, and now they're going to have to deal with what the Cardinals are going to continue to build on in terms of their running game.
Totally. No, just even when you're mentioning with Tip Ryman, all 3 of their top tight ends can catch. Like, it's not something where it's like that they can't catch or that's just a blocker. It's like they were good at catching. Like, there was some diving catch that we saw from Elijah Higgins, who was in a solid, probably like underrated role last year. Like you said, adding someone like Ryman. I think with the offensive line in place that Arizona has, this is also one of those years where they at least have bodies who could fit in at that left guard spot. And they also have some depth now with some of the draft picks. I don't know if an Isaiah Adams is going to start, but I can at least trust him that he played 2 positions in college, interior and exterior, and you were able to see that they brought in a guy in Evan Brown, and coming off of IR, we've seen John Gaines be able to kind of be in that backup guard type of role. With Halty Froholt currently out, Evan Brown's kind of taken over as the starting center, and I think we're probably going to see some veterans there on the depth chart for the most part, but like last year, it wouldn't shock me if some of those rookies end up taking over. Walter, what are some of your thoughts, at least on the Cardinals with their rookie? And technically, I guess this is going to be his rookie season for a John Gaines. Do you feel like that some of these guys could kind of be those mid-round hits that really we haven't seen the Cardinals been able to have for quite a while? And that's something that I feel like that they've really been lacking, is that guy who can come in, isn't necessarily having to be a DJ Humphries, doesn't have to be a Paris Johnson, but is able to come in and be that long-term starter for a team.
Yeah, well, the way they're paying guards today,
yeah,
23 million, getting nervous about being able to keep Will Hernandez, who's our El Toro of that line, and a bell cow. Love to see that us hang on to him. I wrote an article a couple weeks ago about wanting to extend both he and Fro. So I think Fro is the real deal. The guy's so physical, and he's smart. He's got the total package. But yeah, with Gainsey, and with Isaiah Adams, Grizzly Adams, we're going to be have good depth there to count on. I think Evan Brown probably is listed as the starter on the depth chart. Wanted to get your guys' impressions of the depth chart. I have a lot of ideas about that. That was there were some surprises there, I thought, but yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take Isaiah Adams a little time to make the transition back to guard. He was playing tackle last year in Illinois and wasn't having a great year at tackle, and he had a really good year the year before at guard. So I think it's clear he's an NFL guard. That's been settled. So he's going to be in the mix there. But Evan Brown, I think, is going to start. Evan Brown is a strong man. For Frohl to come in and say he's stronger than I am was a really amazing thing. And when I was on the Seahawks podcast with Dan Viennes, he told me that he did some functions for the Seahawks and where their offensive line were going out to dinner and stuff. He said it was clear that Evan Brown was the leader of that group. And so this is a guy with some experience and he's got some leadership abilities. And for being next to Paris Johnson Jr. to have a veteran next to him to start with on this season, I think would be important. The other guy that I really like that's unsung is Tristan Colon. His versatility. I think he's a really good center. I like the kid Schmidt too. I think they've got – this is the deepest offensive line I've ever seen the Cardinals have. They're 2 and 3 deep. Good. I called it Noah's Ark. They got two or three. Yeah, I mean, it's curious to me that why they would keep Kelvin Beachum at left tackle. That I don't get. Although he filled in admirably, but he's so good at right tackle. I don't know why you just don't put him behind Jonah Williams, who, by the way, is, according to Brett, is the weak link. He's not high on Brett's list of players.
Yeah. We pushed back a little on that in our podcast because we also looked at context of he was in a very shotgun heavy scheme that did not go under center with Joe Burrow. And then last year, especially Burrow's ankle, he could not run a bootleg. He couldn't actually do any sort of moving pocket. I don't know if it's going to be one of those areas where you sign the guy and then you extend him a few years later, but I do think that in this type of an offense where he's going to be asking to do a lot of run blocking, I do think that we're also looking at Cardinals running a lot of 13 personnel. It means what side do you want that tight end to be on? He's going to have Trey McBride and or Tip Ryman next to him. That makes me feel a bit better about some of the pass blocking, along with Kyler as a running quarterback. That can sometimes work against you. I think we've all seen when Kyler first came into the league, he had offensive linemen who sometimes did not know where he was scrambling would run into him. He's going to be one of those guys who's going to want to have some of that vision. But I do agree with you in that if Kelvin is really going to be your swing tackle where he can fit on either side, and right now they're just putting him at the one side of the line, that may make some sense for the most part to me. I
think you want to keep Christian Jones.
Just about to mention,
I don't know if you want to expose him to waivers because I think he's a burgeoning young talent, and I loved him at the Senior Bowl. Brett said, you watch him on tape, you don't know how he's getting it done, and you look at the stat sheet, he's not giving up shit. So, but he says it doesn't pass the eye test at times, but he said, but somehow he just gets it done, and if you get it done, I don't care what it looks like, But I really like that pick. I thought that was a really good pick, and he could be right tackle in the future for us if that works out. But
right at worst, if he can be that new Josh Jones for you that you get in the 5th round, who is one of those players who, likewise, I said, hey, Josh Jones is one of those guys we think could probably man the left or the right spot, and he just never seemed like it would fit. But then every time he plays, he gets it done. What are your thoughts, at least on kind of wrapping up the offensive line portion of that, Joe?
Yeah, I love the offensive line depth as well. You alluded to this earlier, what they call kind of weak link positions where what's most important is how bad is your weak link. And offensive line is that. Like you're much better to have 5 solid starters, right, than having a Pro Bowler and some scrubs, right? And they have great depth, as Walter alluded to. I mean, obviously we all like what we've seen from Paris Johnson Jr. and think he's going to continue to grow. Jonah Williams, as you mentioned, there's maybe some context there, but he's a starter. But like Evan Brown, like played guard and center, like that's just a lunch pail kind of a guy, right? And then, Froholt, we hope he comes back healthy. We love Will Hernandez, but like then you look at that second level, Kelvin Beachum has started. I won't, there's no one on that second level with the except, well, there's the young players that we haven't seen enough from, but there's guys on that second level who I feel comfortable if they have to step and start much more than I did last couple of years with guys like Bobby Price, right? Or Billy Price. Like you've got like Kelvin Beachum who started in this league. Isaiah Adams, early draft pick, think he could probably be solid. Gaines, who's looked good so far. I like Cullen as well. He's graded well in limited snaps. And Elijah Wilkinson, struggled last year, but he's been productive in the NFL, and he's played guard and right tackle over his career. So the versatility he brings in, and I think that versatility is a great thing too. That that you look at that. Brown can play guard or center. Wilkinson can play tackle or guard, right? Adams played tackle in college. He's more likely to be a guard. Gaines, they're playing him at center, but he was a guard. There's just so much versatility there, and even both of their tackles have played in the NFL at right tackle, and now Paris is switching to left tackle, but they have that flexibility. So I just feel like more so than any year in the past, like I don't know exactly who's going to start, and I don't know exactly who's going to be healthy, but I'm not worried about that because they have 10 deep that I feel comfortable putting on the field much more so than in past years.
Yeah, definitely agree there. Let's go into wrap up with the run game, just looking at obviously one of my favorite players the Cardinals drafted this year, and then also kind of tying in with some special team stuff where we talked about Amari DiMercato in the running game and how he was considered a cut candidate by many people. From looking at camp, you wouldn't know it, or you'd be looking at him like, yeah, he looks like he's running for his life out there, but he was doing that last year as well, as far as that commitment and that recognition. Sometimes there are guys who are undrafted free agents, Dortch obviously being one of them, where it feels like the world is against them, and you watch where their play is, that because of that intensity that they will have a spot on the NFL roster. Benson's one of those guys who is, as far as talent goes, kind of the other end of the spectrum. You're talking about a guy who is 6'1", 225, has kind of that James Conner size, but also has an explosiveness and speed, even post ACL injury. He got that as a freshman at Oregon, ended up transferring. We saw that breakaway speed happen last year. He's also pretty violent as far as he'll be able to actually lay the boom. Like, it's not one of those guys where you're talking about a running back who's trying to go out there and make a guy miss or is running backwards against the line. One of those guys that seems like the heir apparent to a James Conner. And it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see, because when you look at some of the comparisons for him, on the low end, you got a guy in Kenneth Walker who kind of exploded as a rookie, and then he just had a lot of contact where it was a bit too much, where he's kind of had some injury issues for the most part, but still seems like he can be that home run type of back. That I think is probably the lower end comp for someone like Trey Benson. The highest end comp that I've been able to see when people look at it and say, hey, this is like Kenneth Walker, guy who ran in the 4.3s, guy who overcame a dramatic knee injury and was super productive in a run heavy scheme, was Todd Gurley. And I don't know if he's going to hit the heights that Todd Gurley did. My hope is that he's able to stay healthier than Gurley did for the most part with the Rams. But I think that between those two guys, you can at least say that for the last few years, we've seen the Cardinals be able to have James Conner as one of their best free agent signings, like in the franchise history. And you have to recognize at some point when running backs are getting to that age 30, there's a wall that backs are going to hit one way or the other. Even if you're not going to see that guy hit the wall for a few more years, you do have to have that decision of choosing to pay the guy or not, or how much they're going to be worth. And if another team looks at James Conner and goes, we need a running back, we need a leader, whatever the Cardinals offer you, we're going to offer more. You at least have guys on the roster who can take over. And I think we saw that last year with Amari DiMercato. And the one game Amari was hurt, we also saw how vital and important he was to the team. Walter, what are some of your thoughts on just what we're seeing with some of those running backs? And even with when it comes to kick returning, that was part of what Amari DiMercato's role was last year. And there seems like there's a shot he could be in a similar type of role with that on special teams this year as well.
Yeah, I mean, just have to go back and watch him carve through that Michigan defense at State Farm Stadium in the Fiesta Bowl 2 years ago to know this kid's special. I mean, can Michigan play a little defense? I mean, and look at how it translated into the NFL. 2 of his best games for us were against 2 of the top 3 defenses in the NFL, the Niners and Ravens. And he's just got a knack. He's got a vision. He's not the burner that Benson Burner. He's not the burner that Benson
Yes.
is.
Benson Burns a great name.
But he's not slow. I mean, he's got a gear like he had in the Niners when he broke free for that touchdown, and like he did against Michigan. Like once he sees daylight, he's cooking. But the thing that makes him special is he takes the romance out of the A-gap linebacker blitz like no rookie I ever saw.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself,
Pass
to me,
protection. Yeah.
you're going to protect Kyler, you're going to want to put the best guy there. That to me would, if he just did that, I'd want him on the roster. But instead, he gives you all this other stuff, and I think he could also be a kickoff returner in that new format. He could be good at that as well. So, and what just a tough kid, and he winds up 4.9 a carry. So when Connor was out, I mean, you're not missing, not to say that he's James Conner, because nobody is, but I mean, he's holding his end on the running game. So we're really excited about him. I went into this draft thinking we didn't have to this year draft a running back. The Trey Benson pick surprised me because that was a spot where, and I think Joe was doing this too, where I thought the perfect sense was to draft an edge rusher there. I knew we were going to go cornerback in round 2. We had to do that. But then, at 66, I thought, let's grab one of the, higher profile. Because let's not forget, Gardeck's in his last year, his contract. We didn't know what was going on with Zaven then. And Zaven wasn't a pass rushing threat that we would want. There was and we didn't have a sack in the last 6 games, or 1 sack, and it was Gardeck chasing Justin Fields out of bounds. And it's too bad they didn't sign one in free agency and take care of it. So the void of not signing someone in free agency and then not addressing it on when you had multiple picks in the third is just frustrating. However, I mean, Trey Benson makes you sit up and go, whoa. I mean, he's got a turbo mode that none of the running backs on our roster currently have. So, I mean, he's got that added juice. And by the way, he wasn't used a lot as out of the backfield, but I think he could be, just as James Conner's come on in that role throughout his career in the NFL, I think he could be a tremendous threat out of the backfield. So,
agreed.
I love the depth there. I know people are clamoring for Michael Carter, but I don't see him being active on day. He's not a great special teamer. The only thing I could see if he won the kickoff role, and they moved on from DJ Dallas. But other than that, as much as you like what Michael Carter brings, I don't see that unless we have injuries in the group. I don't see him being even active on game day. So at the most, it's going to be 4 running backs. And I think that's a hard decision. At the most, it'll be 4, but it could wind up only being 3.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. It's probably going to be 4 running backs. I would not be shocked if they like Michael Carter enough as a rusher where I feel like it could be 5th, but I am in the same boat as you of when you're looking at how the team is structured and built. You're going to have James as your top back. you also are recognizing that if you're going to have Trey Benson as your second back, it's really going to depend on how well that pass protection is, because often that back is going to be that third down back whose job is to pass block or be open as a receiving option. And while I do like Trey for that there, I think you're going to probably want to work him in a different way, where maybe it's going to be him as taking a spell for James Conner as that lead back. Where the interesting case comes up with is special teams, because the NFL is a new kickoff rule this year. And I got to see some of that firsthand at practice, and the way that it's structured, instead of it being huge distance apart, guys running downfield and plowing into each other at full speed, it's like there's been a lot of head issues and injuries. So what the game looked at is, can we take that, but instead of making it where it's going to be that huge long run and hit, putting the guys together in more of like a kind of chessboard, but with all the pawns and all the pieces closer together. Now all of a sudden you can have the same kind of blocks and designs and special teams, but it's kind of similar to a running back play, where you're going to have those matchups for the most part. The kicker's got certain limitations, but there's two players that are back to receive the kickoff potentially. And so we've seen this year at the Cardinals, they took Xavier Weaver as an undrafted free agent, paid him the most. He's had some kick return abilities, looks pretty fluid. We got DJ Dallas on a 3-year deal. But when you're looking at that, if Weaver is a guy that goes on to the practice squad and DJ Dallas is back there, who's going to be that other guy who's going to either have to catch the kickoff return, or the second player who now becomes the lead blocker running back with the to be able to pass block for the other kick returner? And I'm like, that's Amari DiMercado's role. He's the guy who can run right into someone's face, blow them up, and it's not a guy where it says, oh, you've got your guy who can blow them up out there. Fine, we'll kick it to him because he's not as good at kick returning. He's a great kick returner too. So I think that DiMercado in that specialized type of role has that carved out on the roster. And as far as wrapping up the special teams, we'll see what goes as far as between with Weaver, if he ends up being able to make the roster. I think that'll depend on what happens with the fact that their main guy, Greg Dortch, who's been that punt returner and kick returner, we haven't even mentioned him yet, and he's going to be one of those guys who's going to get a lot more snaps, it looks like, this year. He has not had a season where he's gotten more than, I believe it was 64 targets in a game was the most that he had, I believe. And I think that he's a guy who could be able to probably approach maybe that 800-yard mark if you ramp it up, knowing that he's probably not going to get as many snaps with this 12 and 13 personnel heavy offense, but he's always made the most of his snaps. Last 2 years, he's had 9 and 11 yards per catch. That's something that or yards per reception, I think. And then when you talk about him as being also a potential kick returner and kickoff guy, that I think puts together one of the better special teams unit that really is going to depend on Matt Prater's health and his consistency with his leg. He still looks fine in camp for the most part, but I think that's the place where the Cardinals, for the most part, they've got a good special teams coach in Jeff Rogers. They've got good players, I think, now. And what we've seen in a lot of ways was one of the complaints they had under the Keim regime was they cut one of their good punter, a good draft pick to keep a certain punter, and then they end up cutting the punter anyway because he wasn't able to be as good. I do think that there's more emphasis on the special teams that we've seen for the Arizona Cardinals. And we even saw in last year one of those plays where I think they picked up a first down on a trick play. I think we're going to see more of that consistency out of their special teams unit, partially because they've got some more explosiveness back there, and they're not having to just rely on Greg Dortch being the one guy in that role to have to do the punt returning and kick returning. You can kind of move him into where he's made his biggest impact, which is dicing up zone coverage down the field.
Yeah, but just one quick thing about that. You saw the depth chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Still listed as number 1 kick returner, number 1 punt returner.
Yep. That's what's going to be interesting to see. Is that going to stick into the season, or is he still going to be in that role? Well,
when you consider that the Cardinals are going to run tons of 12 and 13 personnel, I don't know how, I think it makes sense to give Greg Dortch as many touches as you can, no matter what the scenario, given the limited opportunities schematically he's going to have. They're not going to run a spread, put it that way. And occasionally they'll run trips and he'll be in there. But at this point in his career, he's so good at it. I mean, he should be still the guy. The DJ Dallas signing was a real surprise to me. I still don't understand it. I mean, he's a good player. Don't get me wrong, but it's kind of a niche role that's minor compared to guys like a DeMarcado who can help you on offense. I mean, DJ Giles isn't going to be, he'd be, if he's on the roster, he'd be the last guy carrying the football like he was in Seattle. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I think the new kickoff rules are the wild card in this, and a lot of people who know a lot more about X's and O's than I do have speculated about what that's going to mean and what kind of players you're going to have and what kind of players are going to thrive, who are going to be must-haves on your roster in the past might have been bubble kinds of players, practice squad players. And I think probably the DJ Dallas signing was speculative of those changes and what he can do in that. I think also you have to keep in mind preseason, there's a process there of seeing how things work out. So sometimes people who start out as starters on the depth chart, it's not because that's who they necessarily think is going to be the starter come week one. It's because they want to get a really good long look at what that player does in that position to see if that player can be that, if they're going to be there. So I could, DJ Dallas, if I feel like it's going to be one of two things. Either he's going to be a real boon in terms of that role with those new kickoffs, and he's going to look like a really good signing because of how valuable he is in that really specific role, or he's going to end up being maybe a guy who's on the practice squad who they call up. And that's something we need to remember. Like, you have those practice squad spots that are now much more fluid, and there's the rule changes over the last couple of years. So he's either going to be a central cog to that kickoff, or he's going to be on the bubble and maybe active a few games.
Right. Greg Dortch himself, Joe, said that the new kickoff rules is made to order for me. He's like, this is the kind of setup that, with the way I can make people miss and do inside out cuts and this and that. He said, put me in, coach.
And that's a huge reason behind it, I think, is you basically have to have two kick returners now. With the new rules, there's two guys back there in the end zone. The kick has to be returned. It's considered a live ball when kicked into the end zone, so you can't just take a knee. If it goes out of the back of the end zone, then that's going to basically be where a touchback is, but you're going to have a guy touch and return the ball almost every time, and on average, most of the kicks I saw were returned to about the 20-25 yard line, but there is one that I believe it was, I think it wasn't Dallas, may have been Weaver, where they followed the blocking around the edge. It was a return to like the 35-yard line, so what normally would have been a touchback goes to the 35. The other thing that I think fans are not looking at too is the way the rules have changed is going to be so drastically different from how it's been over the last few years. So this is an average number of returns per game. So you look back in 2008, it's about an average of 94 yards per game. So that's basically saying that when you're kicking off the ball, it's on average getting returned to the 20, and it's getting on average returned at least 4 or 5 times a game. Some are maybe less, some of them are maybe larger returns, but on average, it's probably about a football field's worth. You look at how things have changed over the years with the kickoff rules, and in 2022, it was half that, and last year, no one returned it out of the end zone. The average amount of kick returns was 24 yards because people went, why do I return the ball to the 15-yard line when I do nothing, let it bounce and go to the 25? Right. These new rules, I think we're going to see things emerge back to where it was in the 2008 sort of years, because they were returning it almost every single time because of where those new rules are. And there's going to be some teams that will take advantage of these rules. So the fact that it was a 3-year deal, I think it puts him in a spot where he's probably going to be on the roster for one of those kick returner roles, and then I think it'll be up to Adore, DeMarcado, one of these other players may also be one of the spots that you have, and I'm going to be very curious to see just what Arizona ends up whipping up, because we're going to see, obviously, with new rules, some teams are going to fail at it, some teams are going to find an edge with it, some teams are just going to essentially be able to kind of have it into a negative where they didn't invest into special teams. One of their main guys that they had as a kick returner gets hurt, and suddenly that 4th round rookie who fielded punts before in college returns it, and he gets hit and fumbles the ball back to the other team in a game. These are some of the areas that are part of making the NFL where you try to find an edge because it is a very razor thin margin. Let's go ahead here. At least I think we're going to probably get our show wrapped up here. The Tony FZD is a comment on YouTube, at least talking about great Cardinals content creators in the pod. Love to see it. Love having you guys on the show. If either of you guys have like a place where we can follow you, and whether you've got a hot take or something prepared, or something you just wanted to talk about that we haven't gotten to mention today, if you want to do that as a shout out before we wrap up today. Joe, let's start with you with some of your content. Love having you on the pod as well, and love seeing what work you're doing with the Cardinal Rule.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. It's always good hanging out with you gentlemen, and Marcos, who had to bail earlier. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13, and you can find me on YouTube at the Cardinal Rule. You know, when the season starts up here, we're going to start doing some live streams and stuff again, start talking Cardinals. In terms of a hot take, you know, I'm going to say I think this offensive line is going to surprise people at how good it's going to be. I think at the end of the year, we're going to look back and think it's like top 10 or 15 offensive line overall in terms of just how effective it is, especially with what they do in the run game. And some of that's going to be coaching. A lot of it's going to be like we talked about earlier. But I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised by how effective this offensive line is.
Awesome, that's there. I think if I'm going to go and pick what mine would probably be, and I'm just also going to share a little bit of news that popped up probably about 5 or so minutes ago, but Cardinals do replace the departed B.J. Ojulari with a veteran pass rusher and Marquise Haynes, about 14, I believe, or so sacks as far as his history, 4th rounder in 2018. More, I think, a depth guy who's actually, you're at least getting a veteran, not just having to trot Xavier Thomas up there in a starting role. They also signed Delonte Hood because Max Melton, Keetrell Clark have been dealt with undisclosed injuries. I didn't see number 16 or number 13 at that practice. We'll see if Melton, who's had a good camp so far, is able to make it back in with the season. It's not Marquise Hayes. He's the one guy who I was like surprised to still see on the Cardinals roster. I'm like, he's like pushing around guys out there. Like no matter what happens, he's a guy that has that nastiness to him on the interior that I'm going to be excited to see. Yeah. My hot take is I think that the Cardinals sack leader is going to be Zaven Collins this year. I don't know if that's a hot take, but compared to Gardak, the veteran here, I'll pick Zaven because I think that the opportunity that he's going to have, I think what's going to happen is that having a Darius Robinson on the inside, there's more likely for him to get double teams. I think that Zaven's going to be that guy who, I don't know if it's going to be double-digit sacks per se, but I could see him having an 8 or 9 sack season and it being a bunch of different guys having to get the pass rush production for Arizona. Walter, if you want to reach out to where everyone can find you on Revenge of the Birds, like you are one of like the superstars they're writing with articles and being able to have your podcast as well. If you want to shout out where some of the viewers and for podcast, the listeners can find you.
Well, thank you, Blake. Thanks for having me. It's always great to, talk Cardinals with you, with the professor, and with Marcos. It's just awesome. I'm at WBJ Mitch on X and RevengeOfTheBirds.com. We miss you, Blake. We miss our staff. We've had to cut down, and so it's just Seth and me now. That's had us a lot of pressure, to tell you the truth. So we miss you. We miss Andy. We miss Buck. But hopefully we can get you all back. And then Red Rain podcast. We just had Brett Coleman on yesterday. If you want to catch that, he was fantastic. Spent an hour and a half with us. Boy, he has some great takes on the Cardinals. He's very optimistic. He thinks we're going to be sneaky good. And I hope he's right. I hope, sneaky good would be really good at this point. But you just beat me to Marquise Haynes. That's what I was looking up. I saw it come through the wire, and I was like, "Oh gosh, who is he?" And the kid Hood, Rod Hood, is loaded. I mean, he's a speedster. So that's Hood. They added an edge rusher who can jump right in. It would be interesting to see how they handle this adversity now, having a need, a more glaring need on the edge. Now, could the wild card be Xavier Thomas? I asked Brett about it. I said, how close is Xavier Thomas athletically to B.J. Ojulari? And he said, actually, Thomas is more explosive.
Yep.
he said the problem with Thomas was not the ability, is some of the stuff that happened at Clemson that sort of sidetracked him or whatever. It just never, he was a guy who was like
Injuries age, 5th-year senior, which is usually going to go later because a lot of times they're going to add the younger player for the most part. But like you're saying, he was a
top
5-star
10
recruit
player in the country coming out of high school. It was a high-class recruit for Clemson. It was huge. So maybe we get a little karma going here. And didn't work out with a Clemson kid who I really loved, and they never found the right place for him. Maybe this Clemson kid comes in under the radar and gets in that rotation, and shows his stuff. That would be great. We'll get a look at him in preseason, but in the interim, can we just go around the horn? What would you do? What I would do, I'd put all my chips in trying to get Matthew Judon. That guy has such juice. He's a leader. Yes, he's getting on in his career, but I think if you get him you could probably wrap him up on a 2-3 year deal. It would make sense. He would energize this defense like something fierce. And things right now in New England, every day here, it's like getting more and more clear that they're at an impasse. So I think it's possible we could pry him away from the Patriots. But what would you two do with the Ojulari situation?
I'll be real quick. I'm much more process-oriented person, and I would try to let some of our young guys get some playing experience. I'm like anything. If we make the playoffs this year, it's a bonus. I'm more building for the future. So let some of the guys on the roster get some snaps and see who's a player for us rather than bring in someone.
Yeah, and I am more of one of those people who would say, Walter, ask me again around the trade deadline, because I'm going to be looking there as far as how good are the Cardinals, because they've got a brutal start to their schedule. Second half of the schedule, a lot of rookie quarterbacks. Games seem easier. And we've also seen in the NFL, if you've got a run-heavy team, guys are just exhausted by that point. When you're able to have a solid establishment of the run, and maybe Trey Benson has come along, and all of a sudden you're kind of seeing how the Lions were able to have that David Montgomery, and then they had the new kid Gibbs as being able to have explosive runs for the most part, and then setting up the play action with their tight end and Sam Laporta. We saw them go all the way to the NFC Championship game. I think that if you're able to get off to a good enough start where you can say that this is a playoff team if they can finish and Kyler can stay healthy, that's the point where I would look at making one of those trades potentially for a guy like Judon. I don't know if you're going to be able to maybe even pay him that same contract, because if he comes in and goes off, you're looking at Montez Sweat, with the Bears being one of those guys. I think that would probably be the model that I would look for, because I kind of agree with Joe. If you trade for Judon, you kind of have fixed your pass rush situation. You got stuff ready for 2 to 3 years, but maybe you then are having to pass on adding one of those type of guys in the first round of the draft, potentially, because you've allocated your resources there. I'm kind of in that spot of, I won't say one way or the other. I'll just say wait and see, because I would totally be on board with adding someone like Judon if I know for sure the Cardinals are like not just going to be kind of in potentially for a run at the playoffs with the easy schedule, but we're talking about this as a playoff team that is just needing a pass rusher away, kind of like how Chicago was last year when they were the ones who traded for Sweat. That's what I would do for the most part. We've been here for now almost an hour and 40 minutes for the most part, so thank you guys so much for tuning in. Again, if you want to make sure you're following at least our Redbird Reboot YouTube channel, we're going to be having most of our videos will go up through that as well. If you want to hit that subscribe button, we're having more content that's coming, as well as some stuff, especially with some subscribers that we're looking into. But Cardinal season's almost here. Thank you again, guys, so much for joining us. It's been the Redbird Reboot podcast. You guys have been rebooted, which means it's time for me, on behalf of Marcos, to say that we're logging off. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Peace.